The first time a Japanese commander wrote the word Marine in his field diary, it was not followed by fear or admiration, but by annoyance mixed with curiosity. He had been told these American troops were loud, undisciplined, and overly confident, men who relied on sheer industrial power rather than skill. In his mind, they were little different from the other enemy soldiers he had studied in manuals and intelligence briefings. Yet the first reports arriving from the jungle front lines did not match that image at all. Patrols sent to probe American positions failed to return, not in dramatic explosions or desperate last stands, but simply vanished into the thick, green silence. Listening posts reported movement that could not be tracked, and sentries swore they heard voices, only to find nothing moments later. The commander dismissed these early accounts as nervous exaggeration, the natural reaction of troops facing a new enemy. Still, he noted them carefully, his pencil pressing harder into the paper than usual. Within days, irritation turned into unease. Marines did not behave like the enemy he had prepared to fight. They did not charge, screaming into carefully prepared kill zones, nor did they withdraw after suffering losses the way conventional doctrine predicted. Instead, they seemed to melt into the terrain, using the jungle not as an obstacle but as a weapon. Japanese officers prided themselves on their soldiers' ability to endure harsh conditions. Yet these Americans endured the same heat, insects, and disease while continuing to operate aggressively. The commander began receiving after-action reports describing Marines appearing suddenly at unexpected angles, attacking supply routes rather than fortified positions, and disappearing before countermeasures could be organized. Each report contradicted the image he had carried into the campaign, and with every contradiction, his confidence thinned. He started questioning prisoners, expecting arrogance or ignorance, but what he heard disturbed him more. The Marines spoke plainly, with no dramatic bravado. They talked about their units, their training, and their orders with a calm certainty that suggested discipline rather than chaos. They did not seem surprised by the ferocity of jungle combat, nor did they speak of fear with shame. Instead, they described it as something acknowledged and managed. This mindset puzzled the commander. Japanese military culture emphasized spiritual superiority and the willingness to die, yet these Marines fought as if survival itself were a weapon. They did not seek death for honor, but they also did not fear it enough to hesitate. This balance was unfamiliar and uncomfortable. Nightfall brought no relief. Japanese doctrine relied heavily on night operations, believing darkness favored their soldiers' stealth and courage. But Marines adapted quickly. Flares lit the sky without warning. Machine guns opened fire with deadly accuracy at the slightest movement. Even more troubling were the counter-ambushes. Units sent to harass Marine lines found themselves trapped instead, their routes cut off by Marines who seemed to anticipate every move. One junior officer wrote that fighting Marines at night felt like walking into a mirror where your own tactics are reflected back at you, sharpened and turned against you. The commander underlined that sentence twice. As days became weeks, the commander noticed a shift in his own thinking. He no longer wrote the word Marine casually. He wrote it carefully, sometimes pausing before committing it to the page. He began adjusting defensive plans, spreading units thinner, reinforcing flanks that doctrine said were safe. Each adjustment felt like an admission that his original assumptions had been wrong. Pride resisted, but reality insisted. Marines were not reckless invaders. They were methodical, adaptable, and patient, qualities that made them far more dangerous than expected. Their willingness to pause, observe, and strike precisely unsettled officers, accustomed to enemies who telegraphed their intentions. The psychological effect on Japanese troops became increasingly apparent. Soldiers whispered about Marines who kept advancing even after being wounded, about attacks that resumed moments after artillery fire lifted. These stories spread quickly, growing more dramatic with each telling. The commander tried to suppress rumors, reminding his men of their training and duty, but he privately understood the cause. Fear did not come from superstition, it came from experience. Marines learned from every encounter, and each lesson was paid for in blood, then used relentlessly. The enemy was evolving faster than expected, and traditional measures struggled to keep pace. In quiet moments, the commander reflected on the first assumptions made before the campaign. He had believed that American reliance on machines would make their soldiers soft, that comfort bred weakness. Yet here were Marines enduring mud, hunger, and exhaustion without complaint, turning those hardships into routine. They rotated positions efficiently, shared burdens, and maintained morale through small acts of cooperation that Japanese observers rarely noted in intelligence reports. This cohesion, built not on ritual alone but on mutual trust, gave them resilience. The commander realized that underestimating such an enemy was not merely an error, but a dangerous flaw. As the fighting intensified, orders from higher command demanded bolder action, decisive strikes meant to break Marine momentum. The commander complied, though doubts shadowed every plan. Each assault encountered resistance more flexible than anticipated. Marines yielded ground, only to reclaim it hours later from a different direction. They treated terrain as temporary, not sacred. Where Japanese doctrine emphasized holding positions to the last man, Marines emphasized movement, survival, and returning stronger. This difference began to feel fundamental, not tactical but philosophical. It challenged deeply held beliefs about honor, sacrifice, and victory. Late one evening, the commander reread his earliest diary entries. The dismissive tone startled him. He wondered how many decisions had been shaped by those early assumptions and how many lives had been lost because of them. He added a new entry, longer than usual, noting that Marines were an enemy who could not be measured by old standards. They were not merely soldiers sent across the ocean. They were a system of training, leadership, and adaptability embodied in flesh and blood. To face them required more than courage. It required humility, something rarely written into battle plans. By the end of that phase of the campaign, the commander no longer questioned why Marines inspired unease among his officers. He felt it himself, a quiet, persistent awareness that this enemy would not be easily exhausted or deceived. Marines observed, learned, and returned with improvements every time. They did not fight the same battle twice. This realization marked a turning point, not only in his understanding of the war, but in his understanding of the enemy. The word Marine, once scribbled with irritation, now carried weight, a recognition that the conflict ahead would demand everything he knew and more, because he was facing an opponent who refused to remain what he expected them to be. As the campaign continued, Japanese commanders found themselves confronting a reality they had not anticipated and were poorly prepared to explain to their own superiors. The Marines did not merely attack positions, they attacked assumptions. Every engagement seemed to contradict established expectations about how an enemy should behave under pressure. Bombardment that would normally soften resistance only appeared to sharpen Marine resolve. After hours of shelling, commanders expected confusion, wounded morale, and broken coordination. Instead, Marine units emerged organized, aggressive, and unsettlingly calm, as if the violence had clarified rather than disrupted their purpose. Reports began to describe Marines advancing through smoke with deliberate movements, communicating efficiently even when radios failed, adapting on the move without waiting for orders. This independence unsettled officers trained in rigid command structures. Japanese doctrine emphasized the decisive moment, the belief that a single, overwhelming action could shatter enemy will. Yet Marines did not seem to present such a moment. They absorbed pressure, fell back when necessary, and returned stronger, often within hours. Commanders noticed that Marine officers trusted their non-commissioned leaders to make decisions, allowing small units to operate with surprising autonomy. This flexibility made it difficult to predict their actions. Defensive plans based on fixed expectations repeatedly failed, and with each failure, confidence eroded further. Some commanders privately admitted that fighting Marines felt like engaging water with a sword, striking hard only to find the enemy flowing around the blow. Morale reports from Japanese units grew increasingly concerning. Soldiers spoke of Marines as tireless, men who advanced despite wounds, who dragged injured comrades to safety while continuing the fight. These stories were not exaggerated fantasies, but first-hand observations that spread rapidly through the ranks. Commanders understood the danger of such narratives, yet suppressing them proved impossible. The behavior described was real, witnessed repeatedly in brutal close combat. Marines did not celebrate death, but neither did they fear it enough to freeze. This balance confused Japanese soldiers whose training framed death as the ultimate expression of loyalty. Marines seemed driven by something different, a determination to complete the mission and return alive if possible, which paradoxically made them more dangerous. Commanders also observed Marine logistics with growing concern. Supplies appeared when expected, even under constant harassment. Ammunition shortages were rare, medical evacuation surprisingly efficient. Wounded Marines were treated quickly and returned to duty whenever possible, reinforcing the sense that American units regenerated rather than diminished. Japanese commanders contrasted this with their own increasingly strained supply lines and the toll it took on morale. Hunger and exhaustion weakened resolve, while Marines, though suffering the same environment, seemed better supported and psychologically prepared for prolonged hardship. This imbalance gnawed at officers who prided themselves on endurance. Night fighting, once considered a Japanese advantage, became another source of frustration. Marines learned quickly, adjusting tactics to counter infiltration and surprise attacks. Flares, tripwires, and overlapping fields of fire turned darkness into a liability rather than an ally. Japanese units probing Marine lines often found themselves ambushed instead, their movements anticipated with uncanny accuracy. Commanders realized that Marines studied enemy behavior carefully, learning patterns and exploiting predictability. Each failed night operation reinforced the sense that the enemy was watching, learning, and waiting. What disturbed Japanese commanders most was the emotional resilience of Marines. Losses that would normally sap momentum instead hardened resolve. Units reorganized rapidly after casualties, leadership passing seamlessly to the next man. This continuity denied Japanese forces the psychological victories they expected from inflicting damage. Killing officers did not paralyze Marine units, it activated others. Commanders began to note that Marine culture emphasized responsibility at every level, creating a force that could absorb shocks without collapsing. This realization forced uncomfortable comparisons with their own system, which relied heavily on centralized command and symbolic leadership. As weeks passed, after-action reports grew more candid. Some commanders openly acknowledged respect for Marine professionalism, though such admissions were rarely shared beyond trusted circles. They noted marine marksmanship, coordination between infantry and supporting arms, and an ability to exploit fleeting opportunities with ruthless efficiency. Marines did not waste effort on hopeless assaults, nor did they hesitate when conditions favored action. This pragmatism contrasted sharply with ideological expectations of how war should be fought. It suggested an enemy unconstrained by ritual, focused entirely on results. As casualties mounted, Japanese commanders faced an internal conflict between doctrine and observation. Official teachings emphasized spiritual superiority and inevitability of victory, yet daily experience contradicted these assurances. Marines were not demoralized invaders. They were disciplined fighters who adapted faster than anticipated. Some commanders attempted to revise tactics quietly, emphasizing flexibility and decentralized action, but institutional inertia limited how far they could go. The war demanded adaptation, yet the system resisted change. In moments of solitude, commanders reflected on the enemy they now faced. Marines embodied a form of warfare that blended aggression with patience, courage with calculation. They were neither reckless nor timid, neither rigid nor chaotic. This balance made them unpredictable and deeply unsettling. The realization carried a heavy psychological weight. To acknowledge the enemy's strength was to acknowledge the possibility of failure, a thought many struggled to suppress. By the end of this phase of the fighting, Japanese commanders no longer questioned whether Marines deserved respect. That question had been answered repeatedly, often painfully. The real question became how to fight an enemy who learned from every encounter, who turned suffering into experience and experience into advantage. This uncertainty marked a profound shift in mindset. The Marines were no longer an obstacle to be cleared, but a force to be endured, studied, and feared, not for their ferocity alone, but for their relentless capacity to adapt and persist in a war that showed no mercy to those who remained unchanged. By the final stages of the war, Japanese commanders no longer spoke about Marines with disbelief or irritation, but with a sober gravity that bordered on resignation. Their internal reports had changed completely in tone, stripped of early arrogance, and replaced with warnings written in careful, deliberate language. Marines were now described as an enemy that could not be exhausted through attrition alone, nor broken through displays of sacrifice or terror. They were assessed as methodical, emotionally steady, and dangerously persistent. Commanders emphasized that Marines should never be assumed to be disorganized, weakened, or confused, because those assumptions had repeatedly proven fatal. Every apparent pause in Marine activity was now treated as preparation rather than hesitation. What weighed most heavily on Japanese leadership was the realization that Marines did not merely fight battles, they accumulated momentum. Each landing, each brutal engagement seemed to harden them rather than drain them. Units arriving later in the war displayed lessons learned at terrible cost by those who came before. Tactics were refined, coordination improved, and confidence deepened. Japanese commanders noted that Marines appeared increasingly comfortable in environments once believed to favor defenders. Beaches, jungles, ruined villages, and volcanic rock became familiar terrain rather than obstacles. This growing competence erased any hope that time alone would weaken them. Commanders also observed a subtle but devastating psychological shift. Marines no longer reacted as if they were entering hostile territory. They behaved as if they owned it the moment they arrived. Defensive positions that had taken months to prepare were reduced in days, sometimes hours, through relentless pressure and precise coordination. Marines probed continuously, denying defenders rest or certainty. Even when attacks failed, they returned adjusted, exploiting weaknesses uncovered by previous attempts. This refusal to accept stalemate created an atmosphere of constant strain, one that Japanese troops struggled to endure as resources dwindled and reinforcements became scarce. As defeat loomed, surviving commanders reflected privately on what made Marines so formidable. It was not merely superior firepower, though that played its part. It was not simply training, though their discipline was undeniable. The most unsettling realization was that Marines possessed a collective belief in adaptability. They expected conditions to change, plans to fail, and chaos to intrude, and they were mentally prepared for all of it. This expectation eliminated shock. Where Japanese forces often clung to original plans, even as reality shifted, Marines adjusted without hesitation, treating change as normal rather than disruptive. Captured documents and post-war interrogations revealed that many commanders felt a grudging respect that they never expressed publicly. They described Marines as relentless but not reckless, aggressive but not wasteful. One officer remarked that Marines seemed to measure success not by how many died for a position, but by whether the position was taken and held. This pragmatic approach clashed sharply with traditional ideals, but proved devastatingly effective. It denied defenders the moral leverage they expected to gain through sacrifice and endurance. Toward the war's end, Japanese commanders warned that any future conflict involving Marines should assume prolonged resistance even under hopeless conditions. Marines were said to fight with an ingrained refusal to accept final defeat, a mindset that treated setbacks as temporary rather than decisive. This attitude extended beyond individual units to the entire force, creating continuity across battles and campaigns. Even when exhausted, Marines retained cohesion, rebuilding strength with remarkable speed. This regenerative quality haunted commanders who had watched their own forces steadily erode. When surrender finally came, reflections grew more honest. Removed from the pressures of command and ideology, former officers admitted that Marines had fundamentally altered their understanding of modern warfare. The enemy they once dismissed as undisciplined had proven to be one of the most adaptive fighting forces they had encountered. Marines combined individual initiative with collective discipline in a way that challenged traditional hierarchies. This balance allowed them to function even when leadership was lost, turning potential collapse into renewed aggression. Years later, in memoirs written far from the battlefield, Japanese commanders described Marines not with hatred, but with clarity. They acknowledged that fear alone had not defined their experience. What lingered was respect shaped by repeated confrontation with an enemy who learned relentlessly and refused to be broken psychologically. Marines forced them to confront the limits of doctrine, the dangers of rigid thinking, and the cost of underestimating an opponent's capacity to adapt. The war ended, but the lesson endured. Marines were remembered not only for their firepower or numbers, but for their mindset. They embodied a form of warfare where resilience outweighed ritual, where survival and mission mattered more than symbolic sacrifice. For Japanese commanders, this realization came too late to change the outcome, but it reshaped their understanding of conflict forever. And in that quiet reckoning lay the final truth they carried forward. The most dangerous enemy is not the one who shouts the loudest or sacrifices the most, but the one who learns, adapts, and keeps coming back until resistance itself finally runs out.